What's up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. This is Coach Weasel, and the title of this episode is The Runner Wizard. Now, if you're hoping for advice on how to miraculously hit backdoors more often, unfortunately, that's not what we're going to give you in this episode. At least, not exactly. Choosing the right type of backdoor equity can have a big impact on our win rate. It can make it seem like we're the player who's constantly hitting backdoor equity, when in fact we're just selecting our backdoors very carefully to achieve that effect. Now obviously, if we're talking about backdoor equity, by definition we must be talking about flop play. Very simply, a flop situation is the only situation where we can have backdoor equity. By the turn, we either have a direct draw or we don't. But on the flop, we have draws that aren't direct, but can catch running cards to hit by the river. Now, the reason why our backdoor equity is very important on the flop is that it's very often the decision point in terms of whether we continue or fold when facing aggression. And the reason for that is when we're facing a bet, it's usually a given that we're going to continue with our best draws. We're going to be continuing with our best made hands. In fact, as a really general principle, anytime we have a pair on the flop and we're facing a bet, we probably should be continuing in that spot. Now, there are some exceptions depending on the exact size or the board texture, but generally if we have a pair or we have a draw or we have a strong made hand, there's not really too much of a decision that needs to be made. We know those hands are going to be in our continuing range. We just need to figure out whether we're calling or raising. Backdoor equity, however, that may or may not be a continue. And that's why we can refer to it as the decision point. And what's typically going to happen is that some of our backdoor equity should continue past the flop, whereas the inferior parts of our backdoor equity should fold. Now, it's not just dependent on the backdoor equity itself. This is also dependent on the board texture. A really simple takeaway here is that backdoor equity is more important on dry boards. Think about it this way: we always continue past the flop with a selection of our best draws. It doesn't matter what the texture is, we always continue with our best draws. But if we think about a board texture like King 7-2 Rainbow, well, what are our best draws on a King 7-2 Rainbow? And when we think about that texture, we don't actually have any direct draws. So how do we continue with our best draws on a texture that doesn't have any draws available? Well, the answer is simple. Premium backdoor equity takes the place of those draws. So on a King 7-2 Rainbow, we're looking for things like good backdoor flush draws, good backdoor straight draws. That's going to be a really important component in our defense. Because let's say we only defended pairs and made hands on a King 7-2 Rainbow. Our folding frequency when facing bets from our opponent would be considerably too high. We need to have those backdoor equity hands to make sure we're defending at an appropriate frequency. Now let's take the flip side of things. What about a heavily connected board texture? For example, imagine something like Jack 10-9 two-tone. What are our best draws on a Jack 10-9 two-tone? Well, we're spoiled for choice. We have lots of draws. We have lots of OESDs. We have flush draws. We have gut shots. In fact, we have so many draws that we don't even really have to consider our backdoor equity. By the time we've defended all of our best draws on such a draw-heavy texture, we're already approaching the correct defending frequency. In fact, we often have the luxury of being able to fold some direct draws on such a texture because we have so many high-quality draws on that board. So another way of thinking about that is on such a draw-heavy texture, most backdoor equity combos are simply not going to make the cut. Why would we defend those when we have so many good direct draws instead? In order for a backdoor equity hand to make the cut as a defend on a draw-heavy texture, it has to be extremely premium. And there's a good chance we don't need to defend any of our backdoor equity on the most coordinated textures. So you can see there's a spectrum here where on one end of the spectrum we have our driest board textures, and we're going to defend a fair amount of our backdoor equity. In fact, it's an extremely important component of our defending range on such a board. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, we have the most draw-heavy textures, and we don't really care about backdoor equity on such boards. Now imagine a smooth distribution from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum, there's going to be a point somewhere in the middle where we defend some of our backdoor equity, but it's not as important as it would be on a dry texture, but we still defend more of our backdoor equity than we would on the most drawy texture. Now let's just take that dry texture as a case in point. Let's just say, for example, that on such a texture, King 7-2 rainbow, we need to continue with roughly the top 50% of our backdoor equity. The best backdoor equity we continue with, the less premium backdoor equity we can fold. The implication there is that we need a way of differentiating between our different types of backdoor equity. We need to know what the top 50% of our backdoor equity actually looks like and how we can compare two different types of backdoor equity to figure out which one should make the cut as a defend and which one is less premium and should end up being a fold. Now straight away, this means that a binary system doesn't work here. Now what do we mean by a binary system? Well, usually there's a progression. A new poker player doesn't necessarily know what backdoor equity is. They understand about direct draws, but it hasn't occurred to them that there's a difference between having a backdoor flush on the flop and not having a backdoor flush. Stage number 2 is that someone points out to them what backdoor equity is. It's the idea of having a draw that requires running cards on both the turn and river to complete. Now that usually opens up a new line of analysis for the new player, but it's not very concise at this stage. In fact, it's usually just a binary system where the player is thinking, either I have backdoor equity or I don't have backdoor equity. Either I have a backdoor flush or I don't. Either I have a backdoor straight or I don't. Now the problem is that doesn't help us differentiate between different qualities of backdoor equity. That's a binary system. And the problem there is, if we defend all of our backdoor equity in a certain scenario, we'll nearly always be over defending. It doesn't matter what the texture is. If it's a dry texture and we defend all of our backdoor equity, we're definitely over defending. If it's a drawy texture and we defend all of our backdoor equity, we're not really going to be folding very much. We're going to be hugely over defending in such a scenario. So we need to break down the different types of backdoor equity more specifically. We can then factor that into our thought process to be able to differentiate between the qualities of backdoor equity that we have on the flop. So with that in mind, let's start with flush draws. The very first question we're going to ask is whether it's a nut or non-nut flush draw. In other words, the rank of the backdoor flush draw. Now obviously the only nut flush draw is actually the backdoor ace high on a non-paired texture. But if we have a king high flush draw with 2 whole cards and we actually make our runner flush, that hand is most of the time going to be strong enough to stack off with anyway on the river because it's the second nuts. So instead of thinking about nut flush draws and non-nut flush draws, it makes more sense to think about effective nut backdoor flush draws and non-nut flush draws. So what's the difference? Effective nut means any backdoor flush draw that we would be happy to stack off with if it hits. Now that's going to be dependent on the stack depth because, for example, if we were playing very shallow, any runner flush might be good enough to stack off with on the river. To give you a common example, if we're playing regular 6-max online cash games with 100 big blind effective stacks, the effective nut flush draw is anything that is the 2-card queen high backdoor flush draw or better. So if we have a 2-card king high backdoor flush draw, then that is basically a nut backdoor flush draw. It's not technically the nut, it could still lose against the ace high flush draw if our opponent has it and hits. But if that happens and we stack off and lose, it's just a cooler. We don't need to worry about it. It's going to be plus EV in the long run. Notice as well that I'm using the terms 1 card and 2 card. This is a very important distinction as well. So what's the difference? Well, imagine I hold ace 5 of hearts and there is a heart on the board. That is a 2-card backdoor flush draw because 2 of the hearts are our whole cards. Now imagine a situation where I have ace 5 offsuit, I have the ace of hearts, and there are 2 hearts on the board texture. Now that's a 1-card backdoor flush draw. At first glance, it might appear that these are roughly the same hand. We basically have 3 hearts, and if we catch runner hearts on the turn and river, we're going to have the ace high heart flush. There's a very big important difference with these 2 hands. When we have the 1-card backdoor flush draw, If we were to catch runner-runner to make our flush, it means there's going to be a 4 to a flush texture on the board. It's going to be fairly obvious that we might have a flush. This gives us two key problems. Number one, it's going to be a lot harder to get paid off because our flush is not disguised. Problem number two is that if we have the one card king high flush, then that's a heavily dominated hand because our opponent only needs to have the ace of hearts in the hole and he actually has the higher flush. Now conversely, if we have the two card flush draw, it's going to be a lot less transparent when we actually hit. And if we do have two card king high flush or two card queen high flush, it's going to be a lot less likely that we're dominated by a higher flush because our opponent will also need to have two hearts in the hole. We can see that there's a very big difference in hand strength between having the two card king high flush and the one card king high flush. The two card king high flush is basically an effective nut flush. The one card king high flush is a fairly dominated mid-strength type hand because it's very easy for our opponent to have the one card ace high heart flush, and it's also very transparent that we might have a flush anyway, so it's just very difficult to get paid off. We have much better implied odds with the two card backdoor flush. So we want to keep that in mind when making our flop decisions. It's always better to have a two card effective nut backdoor flush than to have a one card backdoor flush or a flush that's easily dominated if it hits. Let's now think about backdoor straight draws. And we can start straight away with the first question, is it a one card or a two card backdoor straight? So to give you a really simple example, imagine there's a 7 on the flop and we hold 8 and 9 as our hole cards. We have a two card backdoor straight draw. However, if there's a 7 and 8 on the board and we just have a lone 9 as one of our hole cards, we have the same backdoor straight, but now it's a one card backdoor straight. Similar to backdoor flush draws, two card backdoor straight draws are much stronger than one card backdoor straight draws. Two card backdoor straight draws are more disguised when they hit. They have better implied odds, i.e. it's easier to get paid off. And the other key difference is that a two card backdoor straight draw is more likely to be the nuts when it hits. In fact, a one card backdoor straight draw can never make the nut straight when it hits, unless it's very specifically the Broadway straight, i.e. the ace high straight. Every other one card backdoor straight is going to be non-nut when it hits. Now we can take this one step further and start breaking down the number of backdoor gut shots and backdoor OESDs we have. Let's think about a simple example here. Imagine there's a 7 on the flop and we have 8, 9 as our hole cards. How many backdoor gut shots do we have? And how many backdoor OESDs do we have? Or more specifically, how many turn cards give us an OESD and how many turn cards give us a gut shot? Now at first you might need to compute that manually. You might need to say, okay, on the 10 there's an OESD, on the 6 there's an OESD, then on the 5 and the jack there's gut shots. So that's 2 backdoor OESDs and 2 backdoor gut shots. That's fine. However, as you get good at this, you'll begin to spot the pattern. So for example, the pattern here is that when we have 3 cards that are directly consecutively connected, 7, 8, 9, we have 2 backdoor gut shots and 2 backdoor OESDs. Let's say instead we had a gap in our structure. So we have a 7 on the board and we have 10, 8 as our hole cards. Now automatically if we spot the pattern, we'll know that we have 1 backdoor OESD on the turn and 2 backdoor gut shots. And it doesn't matter exactly what the structure is, if there's a single gap in there, it's always going to result in the same amount of backdoor gut shots and backdoor OESDs. As an aside, keep in mind that for the Broadway region, that might change. So for example, if I have 3 in a row, queen, king, and ace, well, I actually only have 2 backdoor gut shots there because we can't go higher than the ace. So just keep that in mind. This mostly applies to the lower regions. Once we get into the Broadway regions, we may actually have less backdoors just because we obviously can't have a straight higher ranked than the ace high straight. If we were to distill this down into a really simple takeaway, the more gaps we have in our 3 to a straight, the less backdoor equity we have, the less backdoor gut shots, the less backdoor OESDs, etc. Now, similar to backdoor flush draws, we also want to think regarding whether our backdoor straights are going to be nutted if they hit. And we can use a simple pattern to help us figure out how many of our outs are actually going to be to the nuts. And this is something that we can borrow from PLO. We can have a look to see if our whole cards are on top of the board or below the board. So what do we mean by that? Again, let's imagine we have a 7 on the flop. Don't worry too much about the other two cards. Let's just say they're low blanks. We have a 7 on the flop and we hold 8-9. We are above the board in that case because we're above the highest card. Now, when we are above the board, it means our backdoor straight outs are going to be nutted. But let's imagine instead on that 7 high board, we held the 5 and 6. What we'll find there is that a decent amount of our backdoor straights are actually non-nut. Some of them will still be to the nuts, but some of them will be non-nut. Some of our backdoors will actually be half nutted and half non-nut. So for example, if we hold the 5-6 on that 7XX board texture, the 8 on the turn is going to give us an OESD, which is half nutted and half non-nut. That's because if we catch the 4 on the river, we still have the nut straight. But if we catch the 9 on the river, we have the low end of the straight. It might not be super important to enumerate all of these in game. Just keep in mind that the more nut backdoor straight draws we have, the better. We need to be very careful with non-nut backdoor straight draws. And also keep in mind that when our whole cards are above or at the top of the backdoor straight structure on the flop, it means that a larger amount of our backdoor straight outs are going to be to the nuts. Now, a couple of other things to keep in mind as well. Overcards increase the strength of our backdoor equity, and this applies to flush draws as well. It's always nice to have 2 overcards to the board. It increases the quality of our backdoor equity. We don't necessarily need that, but it does strengthen our backdoor equity. And the same with backdoor straight draws as well. So if we're holding something like King Queen on a 10 high board, well, we know straight away that we're going to have 1 backdoor OESD and 2 backdoor gut shots. We know that they are all going to be nutted since we are above the board, but also we have 2 overcards as well. So even if we don't make our runner straight, there's a chance that we could just make a top pair of kings or a top pair of queens, and that actually ends up being good at showdown. Specifically with backdoor straight draws, we want to watch out for traps. Now, this is completely made up terminology for the purposes of this podcast episode, so you probably won't hear the term used outside the context of this discussion. So what is a trap? It's when we have a backdoor straight draw which would ordinarily be to the nuts, but as a result of the presence of high cards, that backdoor straight ends up being non-nut. And the same thing can happen with direct straight draws as well. On the flop, where we have a direct straight draw, it would ordinarily be to the nuts, but due to the presence of a higher card on the board, it's now a non-nut straight draw. So what do we mean by this? Let's give an example. Imagine it's a King 8-2 rainbow board and we have 9-10. Now normally when we have an 8 on the flop and we have a 10 and a 9, we know that we have all of our backdoor equity nutted in terms of backdoor straight equity. We also know that we have 2 backdoor gutters and 2 backdoor OESDs, all to the nuts. But the presence of that king changes things. How so? Well, imagine if we catch the runner, queen jack. So now we have the queen high straight. Well, think about that board structure. It's got a king, a queen, and a jack. So what's the nut straight there? It's actually the ace-10. So something which would ordinarily have been a purely nutted backdoor straight draw is now potentially dominated because there's a higher card on the texture. Of course, the presence of that king also means that our backdoor straight, which would ordinarily have overcards, now doesn't have overcards because there's already a king out there. So we've got 2 reasons why the presence of that king weakens our backdoor straight. It means we have more non-nut backdoor straight draws. It also means we don't have the overcards to go with that backdoor straight. So we've more or less covered everything. So let's think about some of the ways that we might deploy this information actually at the table. Assuming we're defending against a bet on a dry texture, as a rough guide, we're going to defend any combo backdoor equity. So that means something that has both a backdoor straight and a backdoor flush. And anything that's a very strong 2-card backdoor, whether it's a strong 2-card backdoor flush draw, and in many cases 2-card backdoor straight draws which are decent, although it's going to depend on the sizing. But essentially, the strongest backdoor equity is combo backdoor equity and very strong 2-card backdoor draws. Anything that falls outside of that is probably going to not make the cut as a defend and end up in our folding range. On very coordinated textures, we don't really care about backdoor equity. We're only going to continue with that absolute ultra premium backdoor equity. That usually means it's going to be some kind of combo backdoor equity draw with overcards. Everything else can just be a direct fold because we have so many direct draws which we can pad our defending range with. Now, we haven't mentioned anything about sizings here, and that's very important, especially since the 1/3 sizing on the flop is so common these days. Against small sizings, we obviously need to push our range much wider. To give you a rough idea, if our opponent's betting 1/3 on the flop, the break-even threshold on that is 25%. And usually when you look at solvers, we don't need to defend 75%. We can defend less than that, but it's usually a good 60 to 70% of our range that needs to defend against a 1/3 sizing. So obviously the implication there is that we need to push our backdoor equity even wider when facing small sizings, but we still want to differentiate. We don't just want to defend anything. There are some hands that might have marginal backdoor equity that still end up being a fold against a 1/3 sizing on the flop. Now, we've mostly spoken about playing as the defender, but this flop hand selection involving backdoor equity also applies to scenarios as the aggressor. So next time you're trying a continuation bet on the flop with backdoor equity, take a moment to evaluate the quality of that backdoor equity before firing. And generally, if something is dominated or it's really not that well connected, it might turn out that it should be a check rather than a continuation bet on the flop. We also want to take into account board texture when we're playing as the aggressor as well. As a really rough guide, the better the board texture is for us in terms of range versus range, the more aggressively we can fire our backdoor equity. Whereas if the board is very good for our opponent, we might actually look to only fire with the absolute best backdoor equity in that scenario, just as a really general guide. If the board's very good for our opponent, we should be checking at a higher frequency anyway. Next time you're in a flop situation at the table, take a few extra seconds to break down your backdoor equity even further and enjoy it when you catch those runners even more often than you are currently. Thanks for listening, guys. Good luck with the grind. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.